Hello, everybody.
Hello.
Thank you for coming. We're going to bury Sergeant Floyd again. This will be the 218th anniversary, so good crowd, good weather. Today we gather to commemorate the 218th anniversary of the death and burial of Sergeant Floyd and to tell of his early life, death, and his 4 burials. Many historians have called him Charles Jr., but he was not Jr. In 1782, at Floyd Station, now St. Matthew, a suburb of Louisville, Kentucky, he was born. His father was Robert Clark Floyd, 1752 to 1807. His mother was Lillian Hampton Floyd. Elizabeth R. or Betsy, born 1773, was a sister. She was born in Virginia. A brother Davis, born 1774 in Virginia. Sister Mary Lee, born in 1794 in Jefferson County, Kentucky. Charles rode the mail weekly from Louisville to Vincennes, Indiana. 110 miles each way, $600 per year plus $50 hazard pay, staying along the road in an area of Indians. His brother-in-law, Thomas Wynn, was postmaster in Louisville in 1802. His father and brother Davis operated a ferry across the Ohio River from Clarksville, Indiana to Louisville. Charles may have helped on occasion. Charles was chosen by William Clark as one of the young men from Kentucky. He was enlisted in the U.S. Army for the Lewis and Clark expedition on August 1, 1803, at Pond Settlement near Louisville at 21 years of age. He was appointed sergeant on January 1, 1804, at Camp Du Bois, Wood River, Illinois. He was put in charge of the second squad of 8 men. He was the youngest of 3 sergeants. Nathaniel Hale Pryor, his cousin, another of the young men from Kentucky, was 32. John Ordway was 29, was regular Army. As a private, he made $5 a month and $8 a month as sergeant, $61.33, a third to each of his heirs, his sisters and brother received, plus his land warrant for 320 acres. He gave up $600 per year for the chance to go with Lewis and Clark, a great opportunity or a great adventure for a young man. The land grant of 320 acres was a great reward to be given, a princely sum. The expedition left St. Charles, Missouri on May 21, 1804. They came into the area of what is now Iowa, Nebraska in mid-July on July 22, 1804. They made camp on the east bank of the river in what they came to call White Catfish, where they laid over until July 27th. On July 31, they were in the area of what is now Fort Atkinson State Park in Nebraska. This is where they met with the Otos and Misuras. This is where, on July 31st, Sergeant Floyd wrote in his journal, "I am very sick and has been for some time, but have recovered my health again." On July 30, Clark had written his field notes, "Sergeant Floyd very unwell, a bad cold, etc. Several men with boils." August 11th, Floyd wrote in his journal that he had visited Blackbird's grave with the captains and that they planted a flag to honor him, which pleased the Indians much. August 15, 1804, Floyd wrote in his journal, "Captain Clark and 10 of his men and myself went to the Mahouse Creek a-fishing and caught 317 fish of different kinds. Our men has not returned yet, and the men, they were searching for Moses Reed, who had deserted, and La Liberté, a French engagé, who had also left." At this time, they were in the area of today's Homer, Nebraska, which you can just about see from here. An old Omaha village site, trying to locate and meet with the Omaha, but they were gone on a buffalo hunt. August 18, Floyd's last entry into his journal. "Our men returned and brought with them the man Reed, and brought with them 3 grand chief of the Otos and 2 lower ones, and 6 others of their nation." A court-martial was held for Reed that day. It was Lewis's 30th birthday, and he issued the men an extra gill of whiskey. A gill is 4 ounces, so they had 8 ounces of liquor. And Cuzat played the fiddle, and the men danced until 11 o'clock. August 19. Clark, we determined to set out early in the morning. Sergeant Floyd is taken very bad all at once with a Bell's colic. We attempted to relieve him without success as yet. He gets worse, and we are much alarmed at his situation. All attention is paid to him. Clark, from his field notes by Osgood, August 19th. Sergeant Floyd has taken violently bad with a Bell's colic and is dangerously ill. We attempt in vain to relieve him. I am much concerned for his situation. We could get nothing to stay in his stomach for a moment. One word here is ineligible. Appear exhausting fasting him. Every man has attended to him, York principally. Patrick Gass, Joseph Whitehouse, and John Ordway all wrote in their journals that on the 19th, Sergeant Floyd was taken suddenly ill with a violent colic. Monday, the 20th. Clark wrote, I am dull and heavy. Have been up the greater part of last night with Sergeant Floyd, who is as bad as he can be to live. The motion of his bowels having engaged, etc., etc. The cause of his violent attack, etc., etc. Patrick Gass wrote on the 20th, Sergeant Floyd continued very ill. We embarked early and proceeded having a fair wind and fine weather, till 2 o'clock when we landed for dinner. Here Sergeant Floyd died. Notwithstanding, every possible effort was made by the commanding officers and the other persons to save his life. We went on about a mile to a high prairie hills on the north side of the river, and there we interred his remains in the most decent manner our circumstances would admit. We then proceeded a mile further to a small river on the same side and encamped. Our commanding officers gave it the name of Floyd's River to perpetuate the memory of the first man who had fallen on this important expedition. Private Joseph Whitehouse wrote, the disease which occasioned his death was a bilious colic, which baffled all medical aid that Captain Lewis could administer. We laid him out in the most decent manner possible. We then proceeded on to the first hills on the north side of the river, where we dug a grave, and on top of a high round knob interred him with all the honors of war, and had a funeral service preached over him. We named this hill Sergeant Floyd's Bluff. We proceeded on to a creek lying on the same side of the river, which we named Sergeant Floyd's Creek, and encamped. Clark wrote on the 20th, Sergeant Floyd much weaker and no better. Made Mr. Fawthorne, the interpreter, a few presents, and the Indians a canister of whiskey. We set out under a gentle breeze from the southeast and proceeded on very well. Sergeant Floyd as bad as he can be, and nothing will stay a moment in his stomach or bowels. Past 2 islands on the south side, and the first bluff on the south side, we came to make a warm bath for Sergeant Floyd, hoping it would embrace him a little. Before we could get him into this bath, he expired with a great deal of composure, having said to me before his death that he was going away and wished me to write a letter. We buried him to the top of a high hill overlooking the river, with his country for a great distance, situated just below a small river without a name, to which we name and call Floyd's River, and the bluff Sergeant Floyd's Bluff. We buried him with all the honors of war, and fixed a cedar post at his head and his name, title, and the day of month and year. Captain Lewis read a funeral services over him, after paying every respect to the body of this deceased man, which had at all times given us proof of his impartiality, sincerity to ourselves, and goodwill to serve his country. We returned to the boat and proceeded to the mouth of the little river 30 yards wide, and encamped a beautiful evening. Sergeant Ordway had written, we set off under a gentle breeze. The Indian chiefs set out to return to their village. Sergeant Floyd worse than yesterday. Sergeant Floyd expired directly after we halted. A little past the middle of the day, we dug the grave on a handsome, slightly rounded knob close to the bank. We buried him with all the honors of war, the usual ceremony performed by Captain Lewis as is customary in a settlement. We put a red cedar post and hung and branded his name and date. We named these bluffs Sergeant Charles Floyd Bluff, distance from the mouth of Missouri, 949.5 miles by water. We then proceeded on a short distance to a creek we call Floyd's Creek. It came 15 or 18 miles today. What was this bilious colic which felled young Charles Floyd, and what did the captains do to treat him? Medicines of the time. No one understood germs or viruses or any of what we know today. Medicine had gone from good or ill humors, as the Greeks had called them, to inflammation, morbid conditions, and nervous irritability. That which was in the body and causing problems had to be removed or depleted. And the major methods for doing this were giving an emetic to make the patient vomit, giving a diuretic to make the urine flow, giving a diaphoretic to make the patient sweat, giving a purgative or laxative to open the bowels, or by bleeding the patient. Dr. Rush, to whom Lois had been sent for medical information, was a great believer in bleeding and purging with the use of his bilious pills, a strong laxative made with 10 to 15 grains of jalap, the root of a Mexican morning glory, which gave you runny diarrhea, and 10 to 15 grains of mercurous chloride, which made it an explosive runny diarrhea. Everybody okay with that? What? The captains undoubtedly gave Floyd an emetic. Some of Dr. Rush's purgative pills, called by many Dr. Rush's thunderbolts or thunderclappers, for the action they caused, and also bled him. Did they help him to die quicker? Very possibly, but had he been in Philadelphia with Dr. Rush, he would have received the same treatment. The captains were doing the very, very best they could with the knowledge they had. Many doctors have believed that what Floyd suffered from was a ruptured appendix with peritonitis. It was 1812 before a physician said that a ruptured appendix and peritonitis could cause death, and 1884 before a successful appendectomy was performed. And young Floyd fit the profile of what we still have today. White males between the ages of 20 and 24 have the highest incidence of appendicitis of any age group and either gender. Gentlemen?
Right. Right file. Right. First of all, I'd like to thank everybody again for being here tonight. I'm going to go through the drills, kind of know what's going on. I want to thank all the Lewis Park people and our supporters here. Special thanks to Ben Hines. Lewis Park Lake. Poise your firelocks. Poise means what they're doing with them fire locked up where they can see. Make ready your firelocks. Present your firelocks. So they're going to step back. Hold their guns down and present. Aim your firelocks, which they're going to aim over the river. Lead this lady here out of the picture. She needs to get over here. Come on. No, come on this way. Fire! Poise your firelocks. So going back to poise position. Now I'm going to order them into the shoulder arms. Shoulder your firelocks. Now we're going to do something that's probably the only place on the Lewis and Clark Trail for this. That is born arms. What they're going to do, they're going to drop their guns together, bring them down and put them on, and then they're all going to bow their heads over there for prayer. Mourn your firelocks. Now I'm going to turn it over to Captain Lewis.
Thank you all for being here today. Today we are gathered here in the presence of our Creator to commit the body of our comrade in arms to the earth. As all men are born into this world, so shall they depart it when their course is run. No man knows when his call shall come, nor is it fitting that he should be so foreknowledged. It behooves all men to know this truth and profit thereby. Man that liveth each day in the fulfillment of his duties and in maintenance of his honor shall not fear to face his final judgment, whensoever and wheresoever it cometh. Sergeant Charles Floyd, our brother in arms, has answered this call to judgment, and has done so in the service of his nation and in the furtherance of the aims and instructions of his government. His sacrifice is real and the same value as if he had fallen in battle. He went to his end bravely, with composure and dignity. Let us profit by his example. Should the occasion arise which calls any of us to follow on that unknown pathway which he has so bravely trod in front of us, those who remain in this earthly realm, let us proceed on to complete the great enterprise on which we are engaged. For in doing so, in a soldierly manner, we shall create the grandest memorial to our fallen comrade, Sergeant Floyd. Rest in peace.
Shoulder your firelocks. The right face. Left, by file, left. To the right, by file, right.
The cedar post at Floyd's grave on the rounded knob 60 feet above the river was a marker for all fur traders, travelers using the Missouri River in the following years. George Catlin wrote this about the gravesite of Floyd. Where heaven sheds its purest light and sheds its richest tints, this rounded top bluff, where the foot treads soft and light, whose steep sides and lofty head reach to the skies. Overlooking yonder pictured vale of beauty, this solitary cedar post tells a tale of grief that was keenly felt and tenderly, but long since softened in the march of time and lost. O sad and tear-starting contemplation, sole tenant of this stately mound, how solitary thy habitation! Here heaven wrested from thee thy ambition, and made thee sleeping monarch of this land of silence. Stranger, but how the mystic web of sympathy links my soul to thee and my afflictions. I knew thee not, but it was enough. Thy tale was told, and I, a solitary wanderer through thy land, have stopped to drop familiar tears upon thy grave. Pardon this gush from a stranger's eyes, for they are all that thou canst have in this strange land, where a friend and dear relations are not allowed to pluck a flower and drop a tear to freshen recollections of endearments past. Stranger, adieu. With streaming eyes I leave thee again, and thy fairyland to peaceful solitude. My pencil has faithfully traced thy beautiful habitation, and long shall live in the world, and familiar thy name of Floyd's grave. In the spring of 1857, the Missouri River, running fast and wild, cut the bluff that Ordway said had been close to the bank. The grave gave up the bones of Sergeant Floyd, and as many were rescued as possible. The skull, leg bones, scapula, and others. The bones were taken to Judge Noah Levering's house to be kept until they could be reburied. But his wife did not want them in her house, so they were taken to Judge Marshall Moore's house. I have not been able to find out if he was a bachelor or if his wife was less squeamish about such things. A new coffin was built on May 28, 1857. The coffin with Floyd's remains was taken by the ferryboat Lewis Burns to the bluff and reinterred in a patriotic and religious ceremony. The second burial. The new grave site was some 600 feet southeast back on the bluff from the original site, with wooden head and footboards to mark it. There was discussion in 1857 of a monument, but nothing came of it. And Floyd rested in peace until the early 1890s. In 1893, his journal was discovered by Reuben Gold Thwaites at the Wisconsin Historical Society. Professor James D. Butler of Madison, Wisconsin, learned of the journal, presented a paper on it to the American Antiquarian Society in April of 1894, and they subsequently published it. These events, along with Elliott Coue's edition of the Lewis and Clark journals, stirred new interest in the expedition, especially in Sioux City. The Sioux City Journal carried articles re Floyd and his grave, and the idea of erecting a monument to honor him. An association was proposed by interested people, and a plan for it was realized. There was only one problem. The grave could not be found. In 1857, the head and foot markers had been broken off, and the remains were below ground. An attempt in early 1895 to find the grave failed. Another attempt was made May 30th, 1895. This search met with more success. Using faded memories and a more scientific method of probing for color differences in the soil, the grave was found. Because they wanted other witnesses to be on hand for the exhumation, especially those who had been there for the 1857 ceremonies, they postponed further digging until June 6, 1895. That day the digging revealed the moldering wood coffin, and it was uncovered. The identification was deemed successful, and on the spot the Floyd Memorial Association was formed. The decision was made to remove the skull to town for safekeeping and recover the grave at the time. The journal covered the activities and the founding of the association, and plans were made for reburial ceremonies on August 20, 1895. Mitchell Vincent platted the bluff and determined that Floyd's 1804 grave was now 100 feet in the air over the Missouri, and the 1857 grave was 360 feet from the solid edge of the railroad cut on the western edge of the bluff. At the June 24 meeting, John Herr Charles was elected president of the association. A monument was very important to him. Elliott Coos and Professor Butler were to be invited to the August 20th ceremonies, and land for the park for the grave had to be acquired and suitable receptacles for Floyd's bones to be procured. It was decided at this meeting to use marble slab 7 foot by 3 foot by 8 inches thick, $40, to mark the gravesite, and a pottery urn to hold the bones. Coos suggested the skull be kept at the museum, but it was buried with the other bones. 2 plaster casts were made of the skull. Phrenology was a thing of the day, you know. It was given to the Sioux City Museum and one to the Iowa Historical Society. P.C. Walter Meyer of Sioux City was their photographer, and a list of the grave views, and we have him to thank for the photos of 1895, 1900, and 1901. On August 20th, 1895, the bones, now removed from the 1857 gravesite, were placed in 2 earthenware urns. A trainload of people was taken to the site. Others arrived by their own conveyances for the ceremonies. Professor James Butler held Floyd's journal in place of a Bible for delivering the funeral oration. There were many speeches. The urns were lowered into the new grave, a wreath of flowers placed on them, and the grave filled in. The inscribed marble slab was placed, so he was buried for the 3rd time. The association began planning the monument immediately. There were several years of planning and fundraising. By 1899, they had received $5,000 from Congress, $5,000 from the state of Iowa. Funds were raised from the public. We have the records of $1 given by so-and-so and the list of all who gave. The final negotiations were made for 21 bluff-top acres around Floyd's gravesite for a park, and discussions with the Corps of Engineers about the planning and construction of the monument. By May of 1900, they had enough money to proceed with all the plans designed by the Corps. Captain Hiram M. Chittenden of the Corps of Engineers oversaw the construction, with his assistant engineer, Bathurst Smith. Chittenden's design, the Egyptian obelisk, would be an imposing in appearance, visible at a great distance, and dominating the valley in its vicinity. Kettle River sandstone from a Minnesota quarry was selected. By late May 1900, plans, finances, and ceremony arrangements were in place. Next to be was the pouring of the foundation, to be followed after that by the obelisk. May 29th, 1900. 110 men left the railroad station at 7 a.m. Half an hour later, the hand-mixed concrete was being hand-poured. It was to be poured in one day, so it would be cured as one solid mass. A solid mass it was, 22 foot square at the base, 14 foot square at the top, 11 feet high, with 32 heavy iron rails interlaced through it. 138.6 cubic yards of concrete. It weighed some 200 tons. Chittenden estimated it would take 10 hours, and the last shovel of concrete was placed at 5:30. By 6 p.m. the men were headed home. Following tradition, the association decided that on August 20th would be the date to lay the cornerstone. They would transfer Floyd's remains to the center of the monument for permanent entombment. So again, August 20th, 1900, in the a.m., the urns were exhumed again, placed in the center of the foundation to be covered with concrete at the afternoon ceremonies. A time capsule by Mayor A.H. Burton was placed beside the urns. The center of the monument base, and the concrete was placed over them, so he was buried for the 4th time. There was a mixed military-religious ceremony. The final address was made. America was played. There were 3 volleys, and taps ended the ceremony for the 4th interment of Floyd's remains. Blocks were laid as they were delivered. 16 courses laid by the end of October 55. 55 feet had been completed. Work resumed on March 18, 1901. High winds slowed the work, but on April 22 the capstone was laid. Work on the shaft was complete. 100.174 feet high. The base, 9.42 feet square. The weight of the shaft, 278 tons. 6 blocks were used for each course. The shaft decreased by 1/3 from the base to the top. Bronze tablets on east and west were placed, and the roadway from the public highway was done. The steel fence were all completed by May for the Memorial Day dedication on May 30th, 1901. The paving around the monument would be completed later. Participants and spectators, new and old, gathered around the grave of Sergeant Floyd. Professor James Butler with the precious Floyd's Journal was there. Judge Noah Levering from the 1857 came from Los Angeles. A crowd of an estimated 2,000 people. $20,000 monument. The bronze tablets were unveiled. A descendant of Thomas Jefferson was one of the speakers. A bugler blew retreat. There was a volley, a salute, 24 guns and taps. A fitting monument, as to Lewis said, a young man of much merit. He was the first American soldier to die west of the Mississippi, the only man on the expedition to die. Now, after 4 burials, Sergeant Floyd rests in peace at the corner of this obelisk monument and was designated the first National Historic Landmark in 1960 by the Department of the Interior. Today we remember Sergeant Charles Floyd again, 218 years later, and we salute him with a poem by Will Reed Dunroy from 1901 that was published in the Sioux City Tribune on May 30th, 1901. Let's see if I can read it. He sleeps beneath the stately shaft, beside the winding river, where prairie grasses clothe the sod, and stunted willows quiver. The waters murmur as they flow, in requiem softly faintly flow, and west winds sigh and shiver. No word can reach his earthly sobbed tears, however loudly spoken. To words of praise, to words of blame, his dust can give no token. He holds his vigil on the hill, in endless quiet, deep and still, in dignity unbroken. Above his solemn resting place, the meadowlarks are singing. Around the stately obelisk, the butterflies are winging. With reverence and peace draw near the grave of the sleeping pioneer. The peons' praise are ringing. His restless feet have turned to dust. His wanderings are ended. But still his spirit bides with us, with courage high and splendid. His strong example paved the way for all the triumphs of today. His hopes on us descended. He sleeps beneath the stately shaft, enwrapped in solemn glory. Eternal hills lift up their heads about him, old and hoary. And like a finger pointing high, the shaft lifts upward to the sky and tells its deathless story. Will Reed Dunroy. This poem was contained in an extended editorial account of the dedication of Floyd Monument published in the Sioux City Tribune on May 30th, 1901. That pretty much concludes it. I just have a couple comments. One, it's 120 years old. It's doing good. It needs some repairs, but yeah, that's awesome. And the other thing is, thank you all for coming.